Hello everyone, this is Rajesh Sengupta and we are here in the fourth installment of our week on colonial interventions and Khadi. So we'll start this discussion today with the marginalization of indigenous textiles. So this is something that we'll study in terms of one of the themes of this week. And so in terms of the marginalization of indigenous textiles, we definitely see a number of textiles which were made in the Indian subcontinent saw a marked decline during the colonial period, and especially in the late 19th century, early 20th century. So if this is something we can understand that with the industrialization in Western Europe, and if that is one of the reasons for which like this decline in the traditional textile sectors that took place. So there are many different ways in which one can understand this situation, and one of the ways in which we see that technology is something that is directly being made the prime sort of the reason for which the decline in the traditional textile sectors was made possible. But then we also see that there are scholars who would argue that there were more complicated issues involved in these cases, and it's not just a very simplistic way in which we can understand that technology, this newly sort of like available technology in the late 19th century in terms of industrialization and mechanization of textile sectors, and like printing and synthetic dyes and so on. Those were not just the only sort of like reasons for which this decline took place. Now, adding to this discussion, we find that economic historian Tirthankar Roy had suggested that there are many different things which were involved, and perhaps one of the things that we kind of ignore in this cases when we talk about decline is the role of the individuals. So in the South Asian scholarship on craft, on textiles and so on, we find that the collective is something that is given the priority. So starting from Kumaraswamy's discussion, and then of course like in the colonial documentation, how like the community identity is sort of like made very prominent, and not really understanding the artisans or any of these people with merit as individuals. So Tirthankar Roy sort of counters this approach, and then suggests that how this kind of like the individual decisions also made a huge deal of impact in terms of sustainment or decline of particular kind of craft making. Now, Roy's discussion, as we see that that certainly sort of concerns the handloom sectors, and some of the examples that he presents are also from like the sectors of weaving and so on. So let us come to like one of the examples that he sort of presents, and that would be of this particular person called Dubraj. And Dubraj is this weaver who we find to be there in the Murshidabad district of Bengal. And when I say Bengal, that is the undivided Bengal in the 19th century. And usually the weaver community, as we have already mentioned, that Murshidabad was known for this different kind of silk weaving, and then this highly complicated figurative narrative brocade making, that is Baluchar saris. And this is this Baluchar sari we have on screen, which we have already studied in the earlier modules. And so in this case, what happens that we find that Dubraj was someone who did not really belong to the usual weaver communities. Like there were weaver communities in the Hindus, and then there were like weaver communities in the Muslims. But then Dubraj was someone who came from the Chamar community, who were mostly the people to work on leather. So, and we find that Dubraj was someone who was self-motivated, and perhaps he sort of took up the this complicated way of doing this Baluchar weaving from his interest on craftsmanship, and of course like perhaps certain kind of like overlapping he had noticed in terms of his work on leather and the other kind of like media he had explored, and eventually sort of like getting his focus on Baluchar making. So then we see that there was this another weaver, a Muslim weaver, who was his guru and who taught him this particular way of doing this weaving, and this particular way in which this Naksha loom, the Naksha loom is something that is this draw loom, this complicated loom in which like all these figurative motifs can be woven. So this is something we find that, I mean, how this sort of like, I mean, passing of the knowledge, or like, I mean, transference of the knowledge from this Muslim weaver to Dubraj, that made this particular kind of making of this sarees possible. And then when Dubraj continued this particular craft, we find that Naksha loom is something that was not sort of widely practiced by the weavers in Murshidabad and other part of like, I mean, sort of central Bengal. So Dubraj became, like, with time he became almost this mythical character who could do this fantastic almost like, I mean, this wondrous weaves on the sarees, and this figurative motifs, the figurative narrations and everything else, which was undeniably highly complicated. So after what happened, after Dubraj died in around 1902, this particular tradition of baluchari making, we find that to have also declined. So we can see that, I mean, there was, it's not just about like, I mean, the threat from the technology, it's not just about how a particular kind of industrialization that sort of like affected the making of baluchari in central Bengal, but it was the lack of skill sharing, as Tirthankar Roy also suggests that, I mean, if there was a way in which, like, I mean, this transference of knowledge from Dubraj to someone else could have happened, this particular tradition of baluchari making could have survived. So this is something we find that it's not just about a large decision that is taken somewhere else, or like, I mean, something that is dictated by the industry, but it can also happen in the very individual level. And Roy presents a number of instances in which we find that how there is this tension between how we understand community, how we understand individuals, and sort of emphasizes the role of the individuals in terms of, like, I mean, sustainment or decline of textile making or craft making. So that sort of complicates this idea about what is being affected by industrialization and what is not. Now, when we consider this, and this is definitely like this innovative sort of Naksha loom that Roy sort of like, I mean, emphasizes on, but then we also need to understand that this is a kind of textile, if we think in terms of, like, I mean, baluchari textiles, as we have already mentioned it earlier, that baluchar textile is something that is not really meant for everyday use. So it's a very highly specialized kind of textile making that takes place in a draw loom, in this very complicated draw looms in which there are draw people who are involved in sort of like, I mean, pulling the warp and then sort of inserting those weft threads in particular places, and then many different weft threads are used for executing these highly complicated figurative motifs. So if this is something we find that to be there, so this is this kind of highly specialized handloom weaving was definitely not possible in sort of like replicating in the machine setup. So even though we find that, I mean, eventually the jacquard loom came into being, but even in that, like, the kind of complication and this complexity that we find in this kind of weaving was certainly not made possible. So this handloom weaving, like this highly specialized handloom weaving, it was very clear that even with the intervention of technology, this kind of weaving cannot be replicated, this kind of weaving cannot be replaced by something else. So this issue was clear, and perhaps, like, I mean, this is also the point from which, like, I mean, sort of Tirthankar Roy sets up his journey to understand that if this kind of highly specialized handloom weaving could not be replaced by the industrial production, then what marked the decline of this kind of handloom weaving? So if this is one way to think about, like, I mean, whether the technology was solely responsible for the marked decline of this kind of textile making, we need to also understand that this kind of highly specialized textile weaving was just a small fragment of the large body of textiles which were produced in the Indian subcontinent. And if we think about the majority of the textiles, those will perhaps be those undyed or just mildly dyed cotton textiles, the unbleached cotton textiles perhaps, and which would be used by the people, the commoners all across the Indian subcontinent. Those are the ones which were produced in a large number, and not this kind of highly specialized textiles. This kind of textiles must have retained their market, or, like, I mean, must have retained their significance among the few elites, but that cannot really be that cannot sustain the entire textile industry, or, like, I mean, the all the activities across the subcontinent. So we need to understand that what Roy sort of looks at in terms of, like, this specialized means of production is something that can explain certain aspects of the decline of textiles, but then there are also other aspects which we need to sort of, like, I mean, focus on. And with that, we see that, I mean, there is this, as I have mentioned, that in the 19th century, the focus of the colonizers and the British administration that sort of moved towards the raw material. So by 1850s, during this time, what we see that, I mean, with the rapid industrialization in Western Europe, all the textile mills and everything were established. So there was a high need for the raw material, for example, the cotton. And we see that, I mean, how cotton production in India, that sort of, like, I mean, rapidly grew during this time, and also not just in India but in the other colonies and part of US and so on. We find that, I mean, how slave trade and everything, all of those things were related to producing cotton. Now with that, we also see that there were establishment of certain mills, cotton mills, that sort of, like, I mean, happened in the Indian subcontinent. So for example, in 1851 we see the Bombay Spinning and Weaving Mill that took place, and this is perhaps an image from Bombay Spinning and Weaving Mill, or a similar mill from India. And with these things, we see that, I mean, the Parsis in Western India, they became very important part of, like, I mean, this trade, in which, like, I mean, yarns were produced and then sent to Manchester, or, like, I mean, part of Western Europe, to be made into textiles, I mean, wearable goods, and then eventually sent back to India and the other colonized countries for selling them and having a high profit on them. So when like, I mean, this kind of, like, I mean, mills came up, and which were sort of, like, I mean, established by the people in India and not by the colonial administration, that was also seen as a threat to the British textile industry, because the monopoly in of like, I mean, sort of, like, I mean, on the raw material, on cotton, if we think about it, that, I mean, that can be, like, I mean, destabilized if there are many stakeholders who can control the raw material in this case. So this is something we find that, I mean, how if in one hand we think about, like, those highly specialized textile making in terms of, like, Baluchar and other, like, highly prized silk brocades and everything, those could not be sort of replicated or reproduced in the industrial setup. But then when we think about, like, I mean, the commoners' clothes, right, like, I mean, in terms of, like, I mean, just the plain woven cotton and everything. So if, like, this kind of raw cotton can be, like, I mean, processed, made into yarn, and then sent to the industry for making them into the mill made cotton textiles, then they can be sent back to India and everywhere else, and the commoners can be forced to sort of, like, wear them, instead of, like, going back to sort of, like, I mean, the hand spun, hand woven cotton. So this is something we find that, I mean, this is in those two cases, like, for the specialized, highly specialized textiles and the common textiles, this two must have been, like, I mean, in very different situations. if we think about like what was the role of technology in terms of like shaping the textile industry in the 19th century. So for the specialized textiles, the technology might not have been that important, but for the textiles which are produced for the common people, technology must have been very important. That if this mill made textiles were made readily available to people, people might go for those kind of textiles more often than sort of like going for the hand spun, hand woven textiles. And this is something we find that the marginalization is very much there. And perhaps I'd say that I'd suggest that the marginalization of the textile making is something we can evidence more in the common textiles as opposed to the ones which are the highly specialized textiles. And so the common textile, I mean the day-to-day people and then their wearables, that suffered the most instead of like this highly priced textiles. So when we think about the marginalization of the textile sectors, so we need to consider these aspects, that which sector gets more affected than the other. And as we also see that the many textile makers like the weavers, the farmers, spinners, ginners and so many other people who are involved in making textiles, majority of them would be making textiles which are plain undyed cotton, or like perhaps like dyed cotton, but the regular ones which would be used by commoners. So if those sectors are marginalized, then there is a huge crisis in terms of like the livelihood of the people, and then the kind of the sustainment of the community life that took place for the centuries or millennia, that was completely disrupted by the intervention of technology. So these are the grounds in which we can consider them different. And in this image, what we also see that how this in this industrial setup where we have like the press for packing cotton. So for example, here we see this abundance of cotton that is there, and then there are those laboring bodies, the dark skinned people that we see from Indian subcontinent, who are wearing like just a turban and then a small loin cloth, and they are toiling to sort of like make them into this small packaged boxes, the boxes what we see it here, so that like they can be easily transported to Europe. So this kind of like activities that says something about like the intervention of this new technology, but at the same time like perhaps continuation of the labor sectors from South Asia. So it's a kind of like a juxtaposition of both, and this hybrid mode of production that we see, in which like certain aspects of the South Asian life is sort of utilized for the betterment of the textile industries in Western Europe, is something that was prioritized, but like giving no profit of this textile making to the people who were actually involved in sort of producing the raw material. And with this we also find that this indigenous textile making and how that suffered the blow of industrialization and also the blow of colonization. And during in the mid 19th century, we find that a number of, from the mid 19th century, a number of revolts that sort of like came up, and not only in the sector of textile making but in the agricultural sector mostly. So this is, it's a model that we find, it's a model of an indigo factory, and it was perhaps made in Krishnanagar in southern West Bengal today, and which is known for making clay models and those miniature models that we see them in the 19th century and later on. And in this one what we see that it's an elaborate setup of indigo factory, in which we see that there are like around 96 people, like these small figurines, human figurines which are made, and then they are all like sort of set in this entire model. And in here, in this part of the model, we find that how there are this indigo leaves are sort of like dampened and sort of kept in water for releasing the color, and then how those water will be then sort of like processed, and then it is used, and then lime is used for sort of like extracting the indigo indigo, the dye fermented solution, and then eventually like how this is beaten over and over by people here in these open tanks. And then for that reason we find these tanks are like completely colored in this indigo color, the blue. And so this is how like this indigo solutions are step by step, those are produced. And then like after like this the concentrated solution of the dye stuff is produced, they are dried under the sun and made into those indigo cakes, and those indigo cakes can then be like sort of sent for different places for dyeing purposes. And we see that in this indigo factory, in the center stage there are all those open tanks, and around them there are some of those buildings and structures in which we see like perhaps like the later stages of processing and everything that takes place. And here we also see this characteristic, this hut shape, like the chala shaped roof which is there in Bengal, and that also suggests something about like how this is a very Bengali indigo production factory that we are looking at. And this model, as we know that that was actually produced for this 1886 exhibition, that is the Colonial and India exhibition, something we have already studied, that how in that exhibition people from the Indian subcontinent were sent to Western Europe for sort of like being present in the exhibition venue and demonstrating that what kind of work they do. And this kind of models would also sort of be presented in the exhibition for people to see them, people to sort of like study them and everything else. Now this is the indigo production is something that also saw that was also something that is very significant in terms of understanding the anti-colonial resistance. So for the high profit in indigo and high profit in terms of yielding this dye stuff, we see that there was a forced agriculture of indigo that was imposed on the farmers in Bengal and Bihar and places like that. And then by 1859 we see a huge farmers revolt that eventually led the colonial government to reconsider this forced agriculture of indigo. And eventually it was sort of like reconsidered, and then in the late 19th century with the advent of the synthetic indigo, we find that the demand for this kind of indigo cultivation was lowered subsequently. But then like we also see that how this forced production of indigo is something that is very much related to making particular dye stuff, that is again like making this raw material which would be then utilized for the textile industries in Western Europe. With this kind of like interventions, we also see that how the artist and everyone else, they have responded to this marginalization of indigenous textiles, and then also like bringing certain aspects of the indigenous textiles was explored. So if we think about like all those things that happened in the 19th century, in the early 20th century with the partition of Bengal, we the proposed partition of Bengal, we find that there was a drive towards sort of like understanding certain cultural aspects of the Indian subcontinent, and textile making was also something that was given high priority. So in Bengal we find that during the partition of Bengal, a number of the nationalist leaders and then artists and commenters and so on, all of them, they have sort of prioritized and they celebrated the very mundane things which we associate with the land, with the people and everything. And in that respect we find this prolific image of Bharat Mata or Bongo Mata, which was initially made as the Mother Bengal and then was held as Bharat Mata by Abanindranath Tagore, this significant artist, art historian from the famous Tagore family in northern Calcutta. So what we see in this image of Bharat Mata, we see this goddess figure who seemed to be similar to like many of the commoner women we see in Bengal, and but like the goddess stature of her is something that is evident in the four hands, the four arms that she has. And then like of course like her proportion of the body is something that is also that follows this Dasatala convention, in which we see that how this particular kind of this 10-part of the head is something that is implemented in the body, is associated with making of the images of deities. So in one hand we see that the deity or like the goddess like qualities in this woman. On the other hand, we see that all mundane things are then associated with her. Like for example, here we see palm leaf manuscripts, which is associated with learning. Here we see, like perhaps like the haystack, and like the which is associated with rice cultivation and so on. Here we see in her hand that is rosary, and rosary is something that is associated with like leaving the society or being dedicated to a cause. And on the upper right arm we see that there is this undyed piece of fabric, and that is something very significant. And what we see here is actually how this woman or the goddess is hailing this indigenous mode of textile production, something which we also know that during the partition of Bengal, the nationalists, they have gone back to the ideals of making hand spun, hand woven cotton, and they rejected anything that has to do with the Western European intervention. And that's the reason we also see that this woman is also wearing this saffron dyed fabric, and which is also associated with courage and sacrifice. And so we see that this fabric of the commoners, they were held, they were shown to be like much more significant than anything else. So the common things which we associate with like the daily life, and then like the common people in the country, is then hailed as something that is very significant part of the anti-colonial resistance. So, and this image is just one example among many of the other things that we see during this time, which would attest that this kind of imagination of going back to this hand spun, hand woven fabric making, textile making, is not just an exclusive imagination of an artist, but it is something that was an emotion or a concern that was shared by many in the Indian subcontinent. So we'll continue on this aspect of like the anti-colonial resistance, the role of textile, and perhaps like the role of the undyed or just plain dyed fabric which is used by the commoners in nation building and everything else in the next lecture. Thank you.